Love Saturday mornings, as I mentioned earlier, because we get to have a chat to Leith Van Onselen. He is one of the two great minds that are behind macrobusiness.com.au, an online financial / economic news service that we love here, macrobusiness.com.au. I'm delighted to say that Leith Van Onselen is on the line. How are you, mate?
I'm good, thanks, Luke. How about yourself?
I am just fine. A week ago when we spoke, I think I concluded by suggesting perhaps, we hear this expression tax reform and we wonder exactly what that might look like, what our current tax system looks like compared to other countries. And you've got some answers. I've seen some of the notes, and I'm amazed to know that income tax based on our wages makes up the large proportion, or at least more than half of the total tax revenue. Is that the same all around the world?
No, it's not, mate. Unfortunately, Australia's tax system is among the most reliant on income taxation in the world. So just last financial year, the one just gone, income taxes accounted for 52% of federal government tax revenue. Now, I'll just also say the federal government collects about just over 80% of the nation's tax. So it's by far the biggest tax source out of all our taxes that we pay.
Yep.
So that's 52%. And the problem we've got, Luke, is that all the other forms of federal taxation are actually shrinking in size relative. So, for example, the GST, which we all pay, obviously, on most of our goods and services that we buy, that shrunk to a record low 13.4% of total tax, federal government tax, last financial year. Now, that compares to a decade average of about 16%. So that's shrinking. And the reason why that's shrinking relative is because there's a whole bunch of exclusions to the GST, which happen to be areas that we spend the most on, and they're growing the quickest. So, for example, healthcare is excluded from the GST, education, those tend to grow a lot faster than wages. And as a result, we end up the share of taxation that collecting GST shrinking. And then, of course, we've got fuel excise and tobacco excise. So fuel excise is shrinking because we're driving more fuel-efficient cars nowadays, just through technology, and also we've got hybrids and electric vehicles. So as a result, the federal government's collecting less in fuel taxes, less in tobacco excise, because we're taxing cigarettes at $2 a dart. So people are A, smoking less, and B, they're going to illegal tobacco, which there is no tax on.
Yes.
And the problem we've got is that Treasury's intergeneration report that was released in 2022 said that personal income taxes as a share of total federal government tax is going to increase to about 58.5% over the next several decades. So it's going to keep increasing. And the reason why there's a problem, and the reason why it's going to keep increasing first, is because we've got this ongoing bracket creep. So personal income tax is the one source of taxation which grows faster than inflation generally, because it grows through our income growth. And the problem with it is we're going to have this increasing burden of income taxes at the same time as the share of workers in the economy is actually shrinking through population aging. So we've got this situation whereby the tax base in number of people who are working is shrinking, while the amount of tax those people are paying is just rising inexorably. And so Australia's facing this shrinking pool of workers paying more taxes to support the rest of the population. And it's pretty unfair, and it's also inequitable and unsustainable. So the solution is to basically broaden the tax base so that more people pay, and to shift the burden away from just purely taxing workers, or mostly taxing workers, to taxing everybody. Now, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. The 2010 Henry tax reform provided a blueprint which basically has most of the solutions that we need, and we only really need to update that. And a couple sort of things they could look at is to obviously lower personal income taxes so workers aren't getting smashed. They should look at raising the GST to 15%. Now, I know a lot of people are probably going to be throwing tomatoes at me over the radio, but you could, so obviously you cut personal income taxes, but you could compensate those on fixed incomes like Job Seeker and pensions, etc. You give them more money to help compensate them. The big one for me is we need to tax our resources better. So Australia has pretty much everything the world wants. So we are rich in iron ore, coal, gas, nickel, lithium, uranium, you name it. We're pretty much rich in every single commodity the world needs other than oil.
Yeah.
And we should really be earning oodles of taxation revenue on the export of these essential inputs. But unfortunately, through stupidity, We don't tax much on these resources, and we actually, in the case of energy, we're actually in effect taxing ourselves because we've given ourselves expensive energy, which is ridiculous given we're one of the world's biggest producers of all this stuff. And I'd suggest that we should copy, what Norway does, what Qatar does. So Norway basically taxes its energy resources at about 80%, and it's sitting on, because of that, it collects oodles of tax revenue. It's then invested that tax revenue in a sovereign wealth fund that's now worth $290,000 US per resident. They are rich as you can get, and even if they stopped exporting any of this stuff tomorrow, they'd still be rich because they're sitting on a massive mountain of funds that are being invested all around the world in Microsoft and all these sorts of things. Probably the closest comparison to us is Qatar. So Qatar exports, they're the third biggest exporter of natural gas. We're second, but we're pretty almost the same. Qataris raise so much money from their gas exports in taxes that their citizens pay virtually zero tax. They have free healthcare, free education, and very cheap energy prices. There's no reason Australia couldn't do something like that, but we don't. And then also the government should also curb tax concessions that are bleeding the budget and increasing inequality, which I'd argue the capital gains tax discount on property, in general's one that we should reform. And all we have to do there is basically go back to the way it was pre-1999, when basically we only taxed real gains. So we basically taxed profit on investments less inflation, which is what we used to do. But instead, the Howard Costello government just basically made it so you only tax half the nominal gain, which basically made the capital gains more enticing. So it encouraged speculation.
Yeah,
and then also shift away from fuel excise to distance-based charging, because as we keep shifting away from, petrol cars and diesel cars, etc., well, we're going to get less and less revenue there, and you're going to be slugging one source of, driver and letting the other drivers not pay for roads, etc. So those are the sorts of things you need to do. Basically broaden the base, cut personal income taxes, and tax more people less, I guess, is the way, rather than just slamming a shrinking base of people who are working.
Every time there's a discussion about taxing higher our resources, the mining industry, and I guess predictably, come out and say you're going to discourage investment. Is there proof that happens? Because they've certainly increased the tax on resources in Queensland, haven't they?
They have. No, there's absolutely zero evidence of it, because Australia basically has market power in those things. So we have what the world needs. We are massive producers of iron ore, coal, natural gas, nickel, lithium, uranium. This is stuff the world needs. And one only has to look at Norway, where they're taxing at 80%, and it hasn't affected their exports one bit. They're still exporting this stuff. All it means is that you have less profits being made by multinational firms who are selling stuff that we own. It's Australia's resources here.
And what does the Sovereign Wealth Fund do?
So what Norway does is it basically collects the tax on on the oil and gas exports.
Yeah.
And then it invests it into it's a bit like, the Australia's Future Fund, which was from the sale of Telstra, but that's tiny.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, it's like a massive, superannuation fund type thing, except it only invests overseas. So the reason why it only invests overseas is so it doesn't inflate the Norwegian currency, the krona. And as a result, it's the biggest shareholder in Microsoft. And it owns all these companies all around the world, and Norwegians are uber rich. As I said, it's worth $290,000 US, roughly. It fluctuates with the markets, obviously. The last time I calculated it, about 6 months ago, it was about $290,000 US per resident. So we've got about 5.5 million people, just a little bit over what Sydney's population, sitting on this fund that is worth oodles. And it's because their government had the foresight to tax their resources properly and then invest that money for the future. Whereas Australia, we don't do any of that stuff. Instead, on the East Coast, we allow, foreign firms to basically take control of our gas, charge us exorbitant prices domestically, which pushes up electricity as well. And then we don't collect enough tax off it. It's crazy.
It is. And what about the cost of government? A lot of people are suggesting in our text on our text line that if we stop the duplication in governments between Commonwealth and state, and had a real look at the efficiency, that we could generate great savings there. But I don't imagine they'd be savings. I'm sure there would be, but you can't imagine they'd be significant enough to alter the tax mix or get them to say, you know what, we've been charging you too much. We've found out that we're a joke and here's some money back. I don't imagine there would be any inclination to do that, would there?
No, and look, the concern's certainly right. We are way over-governed in this country. We don't need 3 levels, but unfortunately this is baked into federation. And to change that, we need to basically have a referendum, and they're very difficult to pass. And so it's basically an impossibility that you'd get that, because the smaller states aren't going to want to give up their rights. Because they'll just think they're going to get steamrolled by Canberra. So, look, it is certainly a concern, but it's not going to change because of the way we set it up in 1901, unfortunately. And it does create broader problems in inefficiency, because we have a situation whereby the federal government collects about 80%, just over 80% of the tax revenue, and the state and local governments only collect about 20%. And as a result, you have stupid policies like this mass immigration policy we're running, where the federal government collects all gains through extra personal income taxes, extra company taxes. So they're incentivised to run this policy, whereby the states are forced to basically pick up the cost through having to provide extra infrastructure, health, educational, all these sorts of things, which is the reason why the state governments are drowning in debt. So look, this federal system of 3 levels of government is bad, and it does create, cost shifting and poor policy, et cetera, and duplication, all these sorts of things. But unfortunately, that's kind of outside the purview of tax reform, because it'll require a referendum and it just wouldn't pass.
Yeah. Time's nearly got us, but tell me, here we go. Australian dwelling starts have crashed to a 12-year low. Here we go.
Yeah, mate, I'll keep this short. Obviously, time's a problem, but as everyone knows, the Albanese government set a target to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years. That's 20,000 homes a month, 60,000 homes a quarter, 240,000 homes a year. And we got some data this week from the Australian Bureau of Statistics showed that over the June quarter, only 44,900 homes were commenced. So that's, 40,300 homes were commenced. So that's 1/3 below Albo's 5-year target. And last financial year, we only commenced 159,000 dwellings, which was about 81,000 below Albo's target. So we're nowhere near it. As usual, they've set this Yes Minister target. They were going to meet this, hugely heroic target, and we're running so far below at the same time as the population's grown by about 630,000 last financial year. So all it means is basically, more housing shortages, more rental prices, et cetera, et cetera. That's the long and short of it. Yeah,
and they don't, when they try to defend themselves, they talk about the bill that's in the Senate, which is, I think, around public housing, but largely. But the real issue is we don't have the workers. There's too much red tape. Why would you invest in building in the current environment? I mean, it's just cross. There's no tick, tick, tick. And you're right, it was all Yes Minister. Doesn't this sound impressive? They come up with a figure and, we end up, it seems, perennially disappointed. Thank you, mate.
Cheers, Luke. Speak to you next
time.
Good
on you. Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au.